The engines arrived every Thursday. No invoice. No phone call. No name on the envelope. Just a white truck with no markings, a stack of crated motors wrapped in industrial plastic, and a fat manila envelope containing cash, always exact, always banded, always placed on the driver's seat of whatever car happened to be parked nearest the bay door. Ethan Cole would hear the truck. He always did. He'd wipe his hands on his shop rag, walk to the edge of the concrete apron, and stand there while two men in gray coveralls unloaded the crates. They never looked at him. He never spoke to them. The truck would leave, and he would stand in the thin winter air of Ashford, Colorado, watching the taillights dissolve into the snow. Then he'd go back inside and get to work. This was a Thursday in February, 10 years after the first delivery. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees overnight, and it hadn't climbed back. The garage bays steamed faintly when the doors opened, the cold pushing in like something solid. His daughter Mia was still in the small back office they called the kitchen, sitting at the folding table with her bowl of oatmeal and her copy of Harriet the Spy, her wool socks pulled up to her knees because the space heater took 20 minutes to do anything. She was 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's patience, and she never complained about the cold. Ethan heard the truck before he saw it. He set down his coffee, put on his coat, and went outside. The town of Ashford sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines that caught the wind and funneled it down Main Street every winter from November through March. Population 4,200. One stoplight, a diner that had been under the same management for 30 years, a hardware store that sold fishing gear in the summer and snowblower parts in the winter. Cole Auto Repair occupied a lot on the south end of town, where the highway widened briefly before narrowing again into the pass. The sign was hand-painted, faded to the color of old bone. The building was cinder block and corrugated steel, 2 bays wide, with a small office that had been converted from a storage room sometime in the early 90s. There were 5 filing cabinets along the back wall of that office, pale blue-green, the color of a hospital corridor. Each one was locked. Ethan was 39. He had the kind of face that had stopped aging somewhere around 32 and stayed there. The beard kept it ambiguous. His hands were always clean when he picked up Mia from school. Always calloused, always slightly stained in the creases where the grease didn't fully come out regardless of what he used. He drove a 2004 Ram with 240,000 miles on it, and he knew every noise it made. He had grown up in Ashford. Left for college, left for work, left for a marriage that had turned into a life before he understood what he was agreeing to. He'd come back in a different shape than he left. That was 5 years ago. The year after Mia started kindergarten. The year after Rachel died. He didn't talk about it much. Ashford didn't ask. Margaret Flynn had worked for him since the beginning. She was 55, a retired bookkeeper who'd answered a classified in the Ashford Weekly Courier and shown up with her own label maker and a crate of hanging folders. She handled the invoices, the receivables, the payroll for the 2 part-time mechanics who worked afternoons. She was meticulous in the way that only retired bookkeepers from small towns could be meticulous. She kept records of things that nobody had asked her to keep records of, because in her experience, the things nobody asked you to record were always the things you eventually needed. When the white truck left that Thursday morning, Ethan came back inside, poured more coffee, and stood at the window looking at the crates. Mia appeared in the doorway between the office and the bay. "That truck again?" she said. "Yeah. She send it?" Ethan looked at his daughter. She was holding Harriet the Spy against her chest with both arms. "Go finish your oatmeal," he said. "I did finish it." He almost smiled. "Then go find your backpack." She looked at the crates one more time, the way a child looks at something they have decided is less interesting than it appears, and disappeared back into the office. Ethan stood there a moment longer. Outside, the wind came down from the pass and moved through the parking lot in a long, low gust that turned the surface snow into something briefly airborne before depositing it against the garage wall in a thin crescent. The sky was the flat white of a sky that had more snow in it. The highway was empty in both directions. He thought about the morning Rachel died. He thought about it briefly, the way he always did, not letting it fully in. She had been 29. The winter had been like this one. He had been at the hospital for 41 hours straight, and when he finally drove home to check on Mia, who was with his mother, the engine of his car had made a sound he had never heard before. A sound he had been hearing for weeks and had not had the attention to properly diagnose. He had sat in the driveway and listened to the engine tick as it cooled, and he had thought, "I know what that is. I know exactly what that is. I should have fixed it." He was not a superstitious man. He did not think the engine had anything to do with Rachel, but he had taken the car apart the following morning and fixed it, and had kept his cars meticulously maintained ever since, and he was not entirely sure the two things were unrelated. He set down his coffee and went to work. The first time he'd opened one of the crates, he hadn't known what he was looking at. That was 10 years ago, in a February that was colder than this one, back when the garage was still new enough that he could smell the fresh paint on the sign. He'd been in business 7 months. He was surviving, barely, with a clientele made up mostly of ranchers who needed their trucks running and retirees who needed their Buicks diagnosed. He had no employees. He had a daughter who was not yet 3 years old and a babysitter named Mrs. Holt who charged him $12 an hour and prayed for him, he suspected, every Sunday. The truck had arrived without warning. 2 men, no markings, 4 crated motors. He almost turned them away. Then he opened the envelope. Inside, $4,000 in $100 bills. A single piece of paper with a handwritten list of 4 serial numbers. Nothing else. No name, no instructions. He called the number on the paper. Disconnected. He stood there for a long time. Long enough for the cold to come through his jacket. Long enough for Mia, asleep inside, to shift and make a small sound and go quiet again. He thought about the $40,000 and the lawyer and the name on the patent filing that was not his name. He thought about Daniel Crane, who had attended exactly 1 thermal cycling test session, the one in which the prototype had performed within acceptable parameters, and who had signed the final design certification without, to Ethan's knowledge, reading the failure analysis appendix. He thought about what it meant that someone had found him, had sent this truck to this address, had known, or correctly guessed, that he would not call the police. He stood there a while longer. Then he uncrated the first engine. It was a Frostline HX9, the motor that powered the company's flagship light-duty pickup and 3 of its commercial freight configurations. He recognized it instantly. He would have recognized it with his eyes closed, would have known it by the weight and the shape of the casting and the particular way the accessory mounts were positioned. He had designed it. Not alone, nothing at that scale was ever designed by one person, but the core combustion architecture, the thermal management system, the cylinder head geometry, the structural reinforcements that reduced flex at high load. Those were his. He'd spent 2 years on it. He'd written the specification document that bore his name on 14 of its 23 pages. He'd also written the failure report. That was what he recognized first, before anything else, before the money even registered. The crack in the combustion chamber wall, a hairline fracture running diagonally from the 4th cylinder's upper seat toward the coolant jacket. He'd seen it in the prototype testing. He'd written about it in a report dated March, 11 years ago. He'd flagged it as a structural failure mode that would manifest under sustained high-temperature cycling, exactly the conditions present in the freight configurations, exactly the conditions present in trucks being driven hard across mountain passes in commercial use. He'd been told the report was being reviewed. 3 months later, his wife was in the hospital for the first time. He'd taken family leave. He'd stayed. He'd never gone back. When he returned, 14 months after that, to collect his personal effects from the engineering building in Denver, his badge didn't work. His parking sticker had been voided. His name had been removed from the specification document and the patent filings associated with the HX9 program. Daniel Crane, who had been deputy director of powertrain engineering and who had never attended a single thermal cycling test, was listed as lead designer. Ethan had requested a meeting. The meeting had been denied. He'd called a lawyer. The lawyer had listened to him for an hour and then quoted him a retainer of $40,000 with no guarantee of outcome. He'd driven back to Ashford, He had $1,700 in savings. He had a daughter who was learning to walk. He had a mortgage on a lot with a cinder block building on it. He'd cashed the envelope and uncrated the engines and gotten to work. That night, after Mia was asleep, he'd opened a new ledger. He wrote the date at the top. Below it, he wrote the serial number from each engine, the lot code stamped on the cylinder block, the precise location and dimensions of each fracture he found, and his technical assessment of the failure mode. He did this without anger. He did it the way he'd been trained to do it, the way 10 years of precision engineering had taught him to approach a problem, methodically, completely, without editorializing. He locked the ledger in the top drawer of the first blue-green filing cabinet and went to bed. He did the same thing the following Thursday. And the Thursday after that. 10 years of Thursdays produced a particular kind of knowledge. It was not the dramatic accumulation of someone building toward a moment. It was quieter than that. More granular, more like the knowledge that accretes in a person who has done the same thing for long enough that they begin to understand not just the work, but the shape beneath the work, the pattern that only becomes visible when you have enough data points to draw the line. Margaret had eventually noticed the cabinets filling up. She had asked once what was in them. Ethan had said, records. She had not asked again, but she had, without being asked, begun maintaining a secondary index, a master log of dates and lot codes and cabinet, drawer locations, so that any particular record could be located within 30 seconds. She had built it in a yellow spiral notebook that she kept in her desk drawer, and she updated it every Thursday afternoon after the truck left. She never mentioned the truck. She never mentioned the index. But when Ethan had once, testing, asked her where the records for February of the third year were, she had the drawer open and the folder in his hands before he finished the question. He trusted her completely. He had never told her why. The records themselves were dense, technical, and utterly without emotion. Each report was 2 to 4 pages, handwritten in the first years, typed on a second-hand brother machine beginning in year 4, and laser-printed beginning in year 7, when the garage had finally turned enough profit to justify a computer. Each report contained the same categories: receipt date, motor identification, structural assessment, failure classification, and notes. The notes were the most detailed section. The notes read like something between a coroner's report and a graduate thesis. There were also photographs. He had started taking them in year 2. First with a disposable camera bought at the pharmacy, then with a digital point-and-shoot, then with the phone he had finally broken down and purchased in year 6. Every fracture documented, every failure mode captured. A record of things that should not have existed, rendered in the flat clinical light of a garage workbench. He was not building a case. He told himself this regularly. He was just a mechanic who kept good records. The work itself was straightforward, more straightforward than most people would assume. Because most people had never had occasion to repair the same specific failure mode several hundred times. He knew the HX9 fracture pattern the way a surgeon knows an incision, not just where it was, but what it felt like under the fingers, how far it propagated under different thermal conditions, what it would look like in 50,000 miles versus 100,000, and what it meant for the driver who would eventually encounter it on a highway at speed. This knowledge sat in him like ballast. The checks that arrived with the motors, Ethan had always deposited them. They were legitimate payment for legitimate work. He fixed the motors and returned them when requested, or he disposed of them when instructed. He paid his taxes. He kept every receipt. His books were impeccable. Margaret had seen to that. Some nights, when Mia was asleep and the garage was quiet, and the snow made the world outside completely still, he would sit at the desk in the back office and read through the old reports. Not searching for anything, just reading. The way a person reads a diary they wrote in a different life, one that still cast a shadow over this one. He had grown certain, somewhere around year 3, that the people who sent the trucks knew who he was, that this was not coincidence, that the arrangement, the cash, the no-contact protocol, the trucks arriving only on Thursdays and only in daylight, was as deliberate as everything else he had observed about the company that had erased his name. They were paying him to repair the evidence of their failure. They were paying him enough that he could not refuse. And they were, he suspected, watching to see what he would do. He did nothing. He fixed the motors. He kept the records. He raised his daughter. He told himself this was enough. He was not certain that it was. What he was certain of, Mia knew how to read a tire pressure gauge by age 6. She could name the 4 strokes of a combustion cycle before she lost her first baby tooth. She did her homework at the folding table in the back office, and she fell asleep there on slow winter afternoons. Curled in the old office chair with a blanket Margaret had brought from home, and the garage sounds were her lullaby, the click of ratchets, the hiss of the compressor, the low radio murmur from Bay 1. She was growing up in the smell of motor oil and reference manuals, and the quiet industry of a man who had decided that what he could control was the quality of his work and the reliability of his records. That had to be enough. For 10 years it was. The news broke on a Tuesday in January. Ethan heard it on the radio in Bay 2, where he was doing a transmission flush on a Silverado belonging to a rancher named Dale Whitmore. The announcer's voice was measured and careful in the way that broadcast voices always were, which meant the information was either not particularly important or far worse than the tone suggested. It was the latter. 312,000 vehicles recalled. A structural defect in the combustion chamber of HX9 series engines, produced between years 2 and 8 of the run. 11 confirmed accidents, 2 fatalities, 14 injuries. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had opened a formal investigation. Frostline Motor stock had fallen 65% at open, and trading had been halted. Dale Whitmore heard it from under the truck, where he was watching Ethan's feet. "Frostline," Dale said. "Isn't that?" "Yeah," Ethan said. He turned off the radio. He finished the transmission flush. He drove Mia to school. He came back and stood in the office for a long time, looking at the 5 filing cabinets. Margaret arrived at 9:30. She made coffee. She sat at her desk and looked at him. "I saw the news," she said. "Okay. The cabinets." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" Ethan sat down in the other chair. Outside, the snow had started again. A thin and purposeless snow that made everything gray. "I don't know yet," he said. That was honest. He genuinely didn't. Victoria Hale appeared in the doorway of Cole Auto Repair at 4:17 that afternoon, 36 hours after the recall announcement. She had driven herself, which he hadn't expected. She was in a dark coat that was not warm enough for Ashford in January, and her shoes were wrong for the parking lot, and there was snow on the shoulders of the coat that she hadn't brushed off. He was under the Silverado again, finishing up something he'd started that morning and hadn't had the focus to complete. He heard the footsteps, heels on concrete. An irregular rhythm that meant someone navigating unfamiliar terrain, and rolled out from under the truck. She was taller than she looked in photographs. She looked tired in a way that no photograph had ever captured. He stood up. He didn't wipe his hands. He didn't offer them. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Hale." She looked around the garage. 2 bays. Tool chest. Lift. The 5 blue-green cabinets, just visible through the open office door. "I drove from Denver," she said. "I can see that." A pause. She was recalibrating. He could tell she'd prepared a version of this conversation that wasn't matching what she was seeing. "I understand you've been doing contract work for our logistics division," she said. "I've been fixing motors that your company sends me. I don't know what division arranges that. I don't know whose authorization. I don't know who pays for the truck." He looked at her directly. "I just fix them and write it down." She absorbed this. "Your name came up in an internal data pull, associated with our recall matrix." "I imagine it did. Our legal team needs." "Your legal team," he said, "can come back tomorrow. Right now, I need you to answer one question." She stopped. "How long have you known?" he said. The question sat in the cold air between them. "I became CEO 4 years ago," she said. "That's not an answer." She looked at the floor. When she looked back up, something had shifted. Not softened. Exactly. But cracked open. "No," she said. "It isn't." Mia came out of the back office at that moment, carrying her book and wearing her coat, which meant she was ready to go home. She stopped when she saw Victoria. "Hi," Mia said. "Hi," said Victoria. Mia looked at her father, then back at the woman in the dark coat. "Is your car broken?" Mia asked. "Not exactly," Victoria said. Mia considered this with the seriousness of someone for whom broken cars were a known and significant category. "Okay," she said, and went back to get her backpack. Victoria watched her go. Something crossed her face that Ethan couldn't fully read. "Sit down," he said. She stayed for 2 days. He hadn't planned that. He hadn't planned any of it. He told her she could look at the records, which had seemed like the only honest thing to do. They existed because of things her company had done, and looking at them was the minimum she owed the situation. What he hadn't anticipated was that she would actually look. Not skim, not delegate, not hand it to a lawyer. She sat in the office chair and opened the first drawer of the first cabinet, and she read. He watched her from the bay, through the open door. He worked. He had 2 more vehicles and a scheduled brake job, and he wasn't going to stop because a CEO was reading his filing system. At noon on the first day, she came out to ask him a question about a classification notation in Year 3's records. He explained it. She nodded and went back in. At 2:15, she came to the door again. She was holding a report from Year 5, he could tell by the paper stock, which he'd changed that year. "You wrote these," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, you were the engineer." "The HX9. Yes." Daniel Crane told the board you left voluntarily, that the design team was complete at that point and your role had concluded. "Did he?" She looked at the report in her hands. The base specification document lists him as primary designer. "I know what it lists. Your handwriting is on 14 pages of that document. I've seen it." He set down his wrench. "Have you?" "The original." She said it carefully. "There's a copy in the product history archive. The version that went public is different." He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't know that existed," he said. "Neither did I," she said, "until 6 months ago. That was when he understood that this was more complicated than he'd thought. He'd assumed she was here to manage him. Now, he wasn't sure what she was." On the second morning, Mia decided that Victoria was acceptable company, which she signaled by bringing her a cup of the terrible coffee from the machine in the back office, and saying, "It's bad but it's hot," with great authority. Victoria drank it without complaint, which earned her another half measure of approval. Ethan showed her, that afternoon, how the crack propagated. He had a cutaway block from Year 6. A motor he'd sectioned himself, precisely, to document the failure at various stages. He set it on the workbench and pointed with a pen. "Here," he said. "Origin point. Under normal operating conditions, this is where thermal expansion stress concentrates. The geometry of this seat is wrong. By about 4 degrees, Victoria looked at the cutaway. She was not an engineer, but she was intelligent, and she was paying attention. And she didn't perform understanding she didn't have. 4 degrees, she said. 4 degrees, and you reported this 11 years ago. Before the production run. Before a single vehicle shipped." She was quiet for a moment. "I believe you," she said. He didn't respond right away. "I know that doesn't," she started. "It's fine," he said. He moved the cutaway block back to its shelf. "The question is what you do with it." On the second afternoon, she tried to hand him a coping wrench. She'd picked it up off the bench to move it out of her way and held it by the wrong end. He corrected her without comment. Just moved her hand to the correct grip. And she looked at the wrench, the way people look at objects they've never really seen before. "I haven't done anything like this," she said. "With my hands. I noticed. Is it always this cold in here? Space heaters in the office." She looked around the bay. The tool chests, the worn concrete floor, the faint smell of machine oil that she had stopped noticing after the first hour. "You could have left," she said. "Ashford. Any time in the last 10 years. With your background, your credentials, what kept you here?" He looked at her. "Mia," he said. "She could go to school anywhere." "Yes," he said. "But this is where Rachel is buried." And this is the town where Mia knows everyone, and everyone knows her. And this is the garage. He said it simply, without sentiment. As though these were objective facts. You build something, you tend to stay with it. She was quiet. I ran a company for 4 years, she said. And I did not know what was in my own basement. No, he said. I am not saying that rhetorically. I am trying to understand how it happened. He thought about it. Someone built the company that way, he said. Before you. The insulation was structural. It was not an accident. It was an architecture. Organizations designed so that the people at the top have clean hands. He wiped his own hands on his rag, a gesture that was as much punctuation as habit. The problem with clean hands is that eventually someone has to touch the thing. She put the wrench down. You could have sold these records, she said. I know, or gone to the press, at any point, any of the last 10 years. I know, why didn't you? He thought about how to answer that. He'd thought about it before, not recently, but in the early years, when the anger was still close to the surface and the money was tight enough that he'd looked at the cabinets and thought about what they might be worth. Because I didn't know what I was building yet, he said. And because Mia needed me to be here. And because he stopped. Because what? Because I didn't want to use it as a weapon. I wanted it to be a record. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. The system, she said finally. The way Frostline is structured. The approval chains, the reporting hierarchies. It was designed so that certain things never reached the CEO's desk. I know, he said. I'm not offering that as an excuse. I didn't take it as one. I'm offering it as an explanation of how I spent 4 years running a company that was burying a safety defect and I didn't know. He looked at her. I believe you, he said. But the system was designed by someone. And someone decided to keep using it. She didn't answer that. Because there was no good answer. Because they both knew the name. The campaign against Ethan started on a Wednesday. He saw it first in a message from a customer named Brent Folsom, who'd been bringing his F-250 inches for 3 years and who called to say he'd heard something about tax issues, wasn't sure if he should reschedule. Ethan told him there were no tax issues and to come in whenever. Folsom apologized and said he'd heard it from someone at the diner. He didn't know who. Margaret found the article the next morning. It was in a Denver business news site that ran a thin line between reporting and rumor, the kind of publication that existed to be cited by other publications. The article claimed that sources within Frostline's legal team had identified a contractor who had been receiving irregular cash payments for a decade, raising questions about undeclared income and potential regulatory violations. The article did not name him. The article didn't need to. By Thursday, 2 of his regulars had canceled. By Friday, there was a piece in the Ashford Weekly Courier, a newspaper that had never once written about coal auto repair in any context, raising questions about a local business owner with ties to the Frostline recall. Victoria called him. He let it ring. Then he called her back. It's Crane, she said. I know. He has relationships with 3 people in the state AG's office. And his personal attorney is the source on the business news piece. I've confirmed it. Okay, Ethan. A pause. I need you to understand what he's trying to do. He's trying to make you look like part of the conspiracy. Like you were paid to bury the defect, not document it. I know what he's trying to do. Are your records? The records are fine. The tax records are fine. Margaret has kept every receipt since the first month I opened. My filings are clean. A silence on the line. I can deploy legal resources, she said. I know you can. Do you want me to? He thought about it. He looked out the bay door at the parking lot, which was empty of the 2 or 3 cars that would normally be there on a Thursday afternoon. Not yet, he said. Mia was in the office doing homework. She'd heard nothing. He'd kept the phone calls away from her, kept his face arranged. But she came to the door that evening while he was locking up and she said, People are saying stuff about you. He looked at her. Where'd you hear that? School. Emma said her mom said something. He crouched down to her level. What did Emma's mom say? Mia chewed her lip. That you did something wrong. With money. He held her gaze. I didn't do anything wrong. he said. She studied him the way she studied things she was genuinely evaluating. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. He found the note on Saturday. In the records from year 4, he'd been going through the files, not looking for anything specific, just reacquainting himself with the chronology. When a slip of paper fell from between two reports, it was not his handwriting. It was on frostline letterhead, old letterhead, the logo from before the rebrand in year 7. 3 words, handwritten, in a tight and deliberate hand. Do not record. D. K. He stood very still. It was an instruction. One that had been slipped into his files when he didn't know. Maybe by the men who delivered the trucks. Maybe by someone else, at some point when the office had been left unlocked. It was also, he realized, the most useful piece of paper in all 5 cabinets. Because it proved that Daniel Crane had known, that he had known Ethan was keeping records, that he had attempted, at least once, to stop it, and that the attempt had failed. He photographed the note 17 times from different angles. Then he put it back in the folder, replaced the folder in the drawer, and locked the cabinet. The hearing was held in Denver on a Thursday, which felt appropriate. Ethan drove down the night before. He left Mia with Margaret, who had an extra room and who had been keeping Mia on school vacations for 3 years without ever making it feel like a favor. Mia hugged him for a long time at the door. "Will it be okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He did not know if that was true, but he believed it. He had learned that belief and certainty were different currencies, and that a person could operate on belief for a long time. It was close enough. He wore the shirt that Rachel had bought him for their 3rd anniversary, which was the only white dress shirt he owned, and which still fit. He did not own a suit jacket. He had considered borrowing one and decided against it. He was not trying to look like something he was not. He checked into a roadside motel on the south edge of Denver and sat on the edge of the bed for a while, not watching the television, not doing anything in particular. The room smelled of industrial laundry and the particular staleness of places where people slept once and left. He thought about the boxes in his truck. He thought about Rachel. He thought about the first Thursday morning, 11 years ago, when the white truck had appeared, and he had stood on the concrete apron in the cold, trying to understand what he was being asked to do. He had never stopped asking himself that question. He thought he had answered it. At various points. He was less sure now. He was in the hearing room by 8:15. Carolyn Pierce was already there, impeccably organized, with the 3 boxes arranged on the table in the order she had specified. She looked at him once, assessed him, nodded. He brought the records in 3 cardboard boxes. Not all of them selected records. Organized by Margaret into a sequence that told the story in the most legible order. The year-by-year documentation, the photographs, the technical analyses, and, in a separate sealed envelope, the note. Victoria's legal team had prepared him, 3 sessions over 2 weeks. A methodical attorney named Carolyn Pierce, who had the best courtroom posture he had ever seen, and who asked questions the way a surgeon made incisions precise, minimal, aimed at something specific. She had told him to be chronological, to be technical, to let the records carry the weight. Don't editorialize, she had said. Don't tell them what it means. Tell them what you saw. The meaning is obvious. He had practiced once, alone, in the back office of the garage on a Tuesday evening after Mia was asleep. He had sat across from an empty chair and talked for 2 hours at nothing. When he finished, he felt no particular way about it. He went to bed. He testified for 3 hours and 40 minutes. He started at the beginning. The first truck, the first envelope, the first fracture he had found in the first motor, and the report he had written that night, which Margaret handed to the clerk, who handed it to the panel, who looked at it with the particular attention of people encountering something they had not expected to encounter. He was chronological. He was technical. He did not editorialize. He described the design process, his role, his contributions, the failure report he had submitted 11 years ago, the meeting that had been denied when he tried to follow up. He described coming back from family leave and finding his name removed. He described the lawyer and the retainer, and driving back to Ashford. He described 10 years of Thursday deliveries. He described each year's records briefly, not exhaustively, but enough that the panel understood the scope and the consistency and the absolute absence of gaps. 10 years, every Thursday. Every motor logged, every fracture photographed and measured and classified. He watched the panel members' faces as he spoke. They were experienced people, bureaucratically seasoned, trained not to show reaction. They showed reaction anyway, not dramatically, just a particular stillness that came over people when they were processing something that restructured their understanding of a situation. When Daniel Crane's attorney began cross-examination, he did so with the confidence of someone who had prepared for a different witness. He had expected, Ethan thought, someone who could be rattled, someone who had kept records in anger, who would become emotional under pressure, who would make claims that exceeded the evidence. He did not find that. He found a man who had been keeping records for 10 years because it was the correct thing to do, and who could respond to every question with a specific date, a specific report number, a specific technical finding, and if necessary, a photograph. The attorney tried 3 different approaches and abandoned each one. He tried to suggest the records had been fabricated. Ethan handed the clerk the dated film negatives from year 2, physical negatives, undeniable. He tried to suggest the cash payments indicated complicity. Carolyn Pierce introduced the bank records, showing every deposit declared, every payment recorded in the business accounts. He tried to suggest Ethan had a personal motive, a grudge, a financial interest, an axe to grind. Ethan looked at him calmly. "I fixed engines," he said. "I wrote down what I found. That is all I did." The note was introduced near the end of the morning session. Carolyn Pierce held it up in a clear evidence, sleeve 3 words. Frostline letterhead, the initials D.K. She did not say anything about it. She just handed it to the clerk. The room was very quiet. Daniel Crane, seated 2 tables to the left, said something to his attorney. His attorney said nothing back. By the end of the afternoon, Crane's timeline had collapsed. He had stated, in prior deposition, that he had had no knowledge of ongoing external documentation of the defect. The note contradicted this directly and specifically. His attorney requested a recess to confer. The panel chairman granted 15 minutes. When they came back, Crane's attorney stated that his client wished to amend certain elements of his previous testimony. Ethan sat very still while this was announced. He did not feel the vindication he had half expected to feel. He felt something quieter and more complicated, the particular flatness that comes at the end of a long effort. When the result arrives, and the effort does not immediately know what to do with itself, he drove back to Ashford that evening. He stopped at the diner on Main Street and had coffee and a piece of apple pie, sitting at the counter. The woman behind the counter, whose name was Paulette, and who had known his mother, asked how he was doing. "Okay," he said. "Heard you were down in Denver." "Yeah." She refilled his coffee without asking. "You okay?" she said again, slightly differently. He thought about it. "I think so," he said. She nodded and went to check on another table. The diner was warm. The pie was good. Outside, the snow had started again. Light and purposeless. The kind that would not accumulate. Spring came to Ashford the way it always did, slowly, unconvincingly, a degree or 2 at a time, with cold snapping back without warning, and patches of snow persisting in the shadows of buildings well into April. The sky lightened. The roads cleared. The parking lot outside the garage went from ice to mud to gravel. Customers came back. Not all at once. Not with fanfare. Brent Folsom called first, 2 weeks after the Denver hearing, to reschedule his F-250. He did not mention the cancellation. He didn't mention the cancellation or the thing he'd heard at the diner. Ethan didn't mention it either. They talked about the truck and about the weather and about how the snowpack was looking for the summer, and that was that. Others followed. The regulars. Then some new people who'd heard about the garage from the regulars. The way business worked in a small town where word moved slower, but stuck longer. Margaret updated her yellow notebook, crossing out a notation she'd made in January that said pending in the column where she tracked active matters. She made her own notation in the margin. Then she closed the notebook and went back to the invoices. Ethan rebuilt the garage. Not the building was fine, but the routine, the rhythm, the particular shape of a day that begins at 5:30 with bad coffee and a child who moves slowly in the morning and ends with the smell of oil and metal and the sound of the space heater clicking off at 9. Mia had made a project, at school, about what her father did. He'd found out about it from her teacher, who'd called to tell him it was very detailed and technically accurate, and that Mia had explained the 4-stroke combustion cycle to her 4th-grade class, with what the teacher described as alarming thoroughness. He'd sat with this information for a moment before finding it funny. Victoria came back in April. No truck this time, no advance call. He had not been expecting her, which meant when her silver sedan turned into the gravel lot on a Wednesday afternoon, he was under a Subaru Forester doing a brake inspection and did not immediately recognize the footsteps. He rolled out and looked up. She was standing in the bay door in a coat that was slightly more appropriate for Colorado weather than the one she had worn in January. She had the document folder under her arm. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was in the middle of carrying it out. He stood up. He was in Bay 1, and he saw her from the lift. He lowered the vehicle he was working on, wiped his hands, and walked out. She was carrying a document folder, legal size, tabbed. "You could have mailed it," he said. "I know." She looked at the folder. "I didn't want to." She handed it to him. He opened it. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. Then, it took another moment before he trusted what he was seeing. It was a corrected patent filing, the HX9 combustion architecture, the thermal management system, the cylinder head geometry. His name was first on the contributor list. His contributions were enumerated, specifically and accurately, across 4 pages of technical description. There was also a letter. Not a legal document, a letter on plain paper, typed. "Mr. Cole," it began. "The record that the company created does not accurately reflect the history of this design or the people responsible for it. This filing represents a correction to that record. It cannot restore what was taken. It can only restore the name." He read it twice. He closed the folder. "The board signed off?" he said, unanimously. The new general counsel drafted the correction. "It's been submitted to the patent office, and Crane, cooperating with the NHTSA investigation." His attorney negotiated reduced charges in exchange for full disclosure. "The recall is underway. Full replacement." Ethan nodded. He looked at the folder in his hands. "The families," he said. "The people who were hurt. There will be settlements. The legal process will take time. But the record is accurate now." Which was the piece that had to happen first. He was quiet. "I owe you more than this," she said. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan. The records existed because I kept them. That's the job I chose. You didn't owe me that choice." She looked at him. She was not. He had come to understand. Someone who accepted simple answers without testing them. She'd pushed back on him twice in their 2 days together in January, both times correctly. "That's a convenient story," she said. "It's the true one. The true one includes the fact that you spent 10 years watching a company profit from a design you made, with your name removed, and you kept documentation that exonerated yourself at significant personal risk, and you never once used it as leverage." He thought about that. "I didn't know what I had," he said. "Not for a long time. That's also convenient." He almost smiled. "Maybe." She looked out at the parking lot. The gravel, the highway past it, the ridge that was still white at the top. "I'm going to restructure the reporting system," she said. Internal. The way information flows to the executive level. The layers that existed to insulate the top from what was happening below. "I'm dismantling them." "Good. It'll take 18 months. Maybe 2 years." "Good," he said again. "I'm telling you because—" She paused. "Because you were the one who showed me what the insulation actually costs. Not abstractly. You showed me 10 years of it, in paper, in a filing cabinet, in a town I'd never visited." He didn't answer right away. "The cabinets are still here," he said. "I know. What do you want me to do with them?" She thought about it. That's your decision. He nodded. The sound of the back door banging open. Mia came out in her after-school clothes, jacket unzipped, backpack slung over one shoulder. She stopped when she saw Victoria. Then her face reorganized itself into recognition. "You came back," Mia said. "I did." Mia looked at her father. "Is it about the engines again?" "Sort of," he said. She considered this with the economy of someone who had heard enough about engines to form an accurate opinion of their importance in her life. "Did you fix it?" she asked Victoria. Victoria looked at the folder that Ethan was still holding. "We fixed some of it," she said. Mia thought about this. "Okay," she said, and dropped her backpack and went to see if Margaret had left anything good in the office refrigerator. Victoria watched her go. "She's like you," she said. "She's better," he said. "Better at most things already." Victoria looked at him. Then she held out her hand. He took it. Her grip was better than it had been in January. She'd been paying attention. "Thank you," she said. He didn't say, "You're welcome," because that implied a favor. And this had not been a favor. He just nodded. She walked back to the silver sedan that was wrong for the gravel. She reversed carefully. She drove to the highway and turned toward Denver. He stood in the parking lot and watched until the car was gone. Then, he went back inside. The 5 blue-green cabinets stood along the wall, as they always had. Margaret's index was in the top drawer of her desk. The record was complete. He stood there for a moment. Then he made a decision. Not about the cabinets that would take more thought. And he wasn't going to rush it. A different decision. Smaller and more immediate. He made a second pot of coffee. He brought Mia a cup of hot chocolate from the machine, which she accepted with the seriousness of someone receiving something they have already decided they deserve. He sat at the desk and helped her with her math homework, which was fractions, which she'd announced were stupid and which he'd said were actually the foundation of everything he did. "Fractions?" she said. "Compression ratios," he said. "Gear ratios. Fuel mixture. All fractions." She looked at her worksheet with a different expression. "Okay," she said. "Show me." Outside, the sky had gone the particular shade of blue that Ashford got in April, not quite winter, not quite spring. The light still carrying something cold in it, but angled differently, lower, promising. The snow on the ridge was retreating. The highway was bare. He worked through the fractions with her until dinner. He made pasta, which was what she'd asked for. He did the dishes while she read in the back room, and then he checked the locks and turned off the bay lights and stood for a moment in the dark of the garage, looking at the cabinets. One day he would decide what to do with them. Tonight they could stay where they were. He turned off the last light and went to bed.